I just want to make a quick response to something that I've been seeing a lot online. There is a widespread perception that the situation in Gaza, the plight of the Palestinians, is somehow ignored by the media. Now, I find this a little bit strange because it seems that almost every day there is something in the press about either Gaza or the Palestinians or the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I really don't know where this is coming from. There may be a perception of bias in the media, but that's not the same thing as the conflict being ignored. And I've already mentioned what I think of bias in this conflict in the previous video. Basically, both sides accuse big networks of bias. The Palestinians say that their plight is ignored and only the Israelis are focused on. Some Israelis have been saying exactly the same thing. Oh, why not show the Hamas rockets? A quick word on the latest escalation. One of the problems if you say anything that sounds pro-Israeli is you're automatically branded callous fascist Zionist who doesn't care about Palestinian suffering. I think it's horrible what's happening in the Gaza Strip in terms of Palestinian suffering. But from what I see, it's Hamas that's brought this on. It was Hamas, not Israel, that broke the Egyptian brokered ceasefire. Israel stopped its action for 6 hours. In that time, what it received was 80 rockets from Hamas. And for those who think these rockets are harmless, the Israeli man who was killed and numerous others who have been injured counters that argument. The only reason we haven't been seeing mass Israeli deaths is because Iron Dome is largely an effective system. People look solely from an emotional perspective that, oh, look at the hundreds of Palestinians being killed and injured and only 1 or 2 Israelis. But that is missing the point that the intention is still there. This is not because there's no intention to kill Israelis. There's absolutely intention to kill Israelis. And if there's no Iron Dome, it's very conceivable that there would be mass Israeli fatalities. I think it's awful what's happening to the Palestinian civilians, but I believe it's Hamas that has brought this situation on. They knew what would happen. I honestly think that Hamas cares much more about attacking Israel than it does about Palestinian civilians. I've had people actually go so far as to claim that Hamas is actually has no human rights issue in the Palestinian territories. Now that's incredibly ignorant. Hamas has a long track record of serious human rights violations against the Palestinians, and woe behold any Palestinian who stands up to them. For Israel's point, in terms of the full ground invasion, I don't know if I support that, because unfortunately it is going to lead to a lot more civilian deaths, and it's going to lead to further hatred against Israel. But the point here is Hamas is doing something very cynical. They're provoking this situation by refusing to stop firing at Israel. They had the chance and they refused. Israel takes action as any country would, and then because there's high civilian casualties, Israel gets demonized in the eyes of the world. Now, there's a few points I would like to make. It's true that a lot of Palestinians have died, and I hope Israel does everything in its power to prevent that. I'm not sure if the knocking technique is enough. I think they have to do a lot more. But it just seems very strange that Israel is the only country that is put on a pedestal whereby if it defends itself from a terrorist organisation, then it is vilified. I just don't get that. Call me ignorant, call me a Zionist, call me what you will, but any other major country in the world that is attacked by rockets or suffers a terrorist incident would take action. I mean, look at China earlier this year. They suffered several Islamist attacks. They took sweeping actions. I didn't see the same level of condemnation against China. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to criticism of Israel. And that's not the same as blindly supporting everything Israel does. I believe Israel is also guilty of breaking previous ceasefires, for example by continued settlement building. But I've seen people come out with things like Hamas don't want a ceasefire, they want an end to Israel's illegal occupation. What they're basically saying is they believe that Israel's not a legitimate state. Okay, that's a position to take. But what I would say is, if you are starting that as your position, there'll never be any solution to this conflict, because Israel's not going away anytime soon. You can argue till you're blue in the face about the unfairness of how Israel began over 60 years ago, but there's many countries that began in questionable circumstances. So I just think there's something more to it than supposed moral outrage about Israel, because the people who vilify Israel the hardest seem to be completely oblivious to some other humanitarian situations in the world. My question would be, why is a Palestinian life considered more important than the Rohingya people in Burma, or the South Sudanese, or those in northern Iraq, or those in Syria for that matter? Syria is a glaring example. 170,000 dead, and yes, it's got a lot of media attention over the last few years, but if you look at, I just don't buy this thing about Gaza being ignored, because actually if you look at the fatalities, and I know this sounds like a very morbid way to talk about it, but it's just a fact. You're comparing 250 people to 170,000 people. That I don't see why people think that Gaza is being ignored, because over the last few weeks, apart from this development on MH17, over the last week the only news I've seen is about Israel and Gaza. So I just don't get where this is coming from, this perception that it's an ignored conflict. It really, really isn't. I would say it's probably the most covered conflict, proportionally speaking, in the world. If you consider, in 60 years, it's estimated 21,500 people have died on both sides. Mostly Palestinians, but also several thousand Israelis. Now, I would never trivialize any conflict, but it is striking that if you look at other conflicts whereby, look at the Congo, 5.4 million deaths, either from violence or war-related diseases. 5.4 million. Now, look at the media coverage of the Congo, compared to the Democratic Republic of Congo, I should say, compared to the Holy Land, and see which gets more attention. So I think it's disingenuous when people claim that Gaza isn't getting attention. I even saw one guy, like the BBC was reporting about MH17, and one guy was like, what about Gaza? I'm sick of hearing about Gaza, quite frankly. And that's not the same as being not caring about Palestinian civilians. I'm just sick of the disingenuous argument here, because I think it is disingenuous to express this moral outrage against the evil Israelis whilst ignoring the context that what they're having to. I mean, really, let's just consider for a second. And I have to say, I used to be like these people. I used to say, oh, look at these barbaric Israelis just killing Palestinians for fun. But honestly, if people were in the position of being Israeli Prime Minister, what would they do? Honestly. Tony Blair was speaking on Israeli TV, and I know these people have no time for Tony Blair, but he raised a fair point. As British Prime Minister, if Britain was hit by rocket attacks, he would act. And any world leader would do the same. Putin acted. When Russian cities were hit by Chechen terrorists, what happened? He went into Chechnya, and there was 2 bloody wars there. Well, the first was launched by Yeltsin. But the point is, it seems that Israel is the only country that gets vilified on this level when it acts. Now, I believe that the Palestinian suffering must be put squarely at the hands of Hamas. Yes, Israel has responsibility to do all they can to reduce civilian casualties, and I think they could do more actually, but it's a case of this notion that Israel should just sit there and take it. That's perverse. That Israel should just take and not, just because there's been 1 or 2 reported Israeli deaths. And by the way, what hasn't been reported is the Israelis who have been injured, because there has been. So people sort of respond emotionally because they see these terrible images of Palestinian kids blown up, and they're horrible images. I mean, you'd have to be a pretty cold bastard not to have some human reaction to that. But you could take similar photos in any war zone around the world and you would think that people would respond the same way. It's just that this, far from being ignored, this conflict gets a lot more exposure than most other war zones in the world. I mean, the Mexican drug war has cost thousands upon thousands of lives, and it actually gets relatively little coverage on the BBC. The only coverage I've seen is late at night on News 24, occasionally. So, I just don't get why there's this obsession about the Palestinian plight compared to other humanitarian situations in the world. And I think the real reason is something a bit more sinister. I'm not saying everyone who criticizes Israel is anti-Semitic, of course not. There's many Israelis who criticize Israel, there's many Jews who criticize Israel. I'm not so ignorant as to say that, but I do believe many of those who claim outrage at the Palestinian issue are actually motivated by anti-Semitism. Because they'll say they're anti-Israel, but I think the real thing is, I mean, consider this, Palestinian children are taught from an early age to hate Jews. This is a fact. So it's a culture built on hatred. Because, and I'm not blaming civilians for that, they're living under a brutal terrorist organisation, which people say Hamas was democratically elected, but this is not a normal situation. You know, Hamas is an organisation that rules through an iron fist. So I very much doubt that was, I think there is a lot of support for Hamas in the Palestinian territories, but those who don't like Hamas, what do you think their fate is? You know, it's difficult to take a position on this conflict, and I've already been accused of being a filthy Zionist apologist and so on. I don't care whether people believe it or not, but I actually, when I see Palestinian children blowing up, of course it's horrible. And when I say I'm sick of hearing about Gaza, I'm not saying I'm sick of hearing, I'm sick of, I am not saying I'm trivializing the Palestinian deaths, but what I am sick of is the lack of proportionality in terms of other conflicts in the world. Because I think there's a huge amount of hypocrisy when it comes to criticism of Israel. I really do. And if that makes me a filthy Zionist, so be it. Because I am just responding to common sense. And common sense dictates that any country in the world would be responding the same way. I mean, if you want to make an equivalency here in the UK, this would be the equivalent of, during the height of the Troubles, if the IRA was to fire mortars from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland, into Belfast. Do you really think the British government would do nothing? Of course not. It would be a state of war. Now, thankfully, that sort of situation never happened, but it is the equivalency. I'll cite another example. What if separatists in Corsica were to fire rockets into France? Do you think the French government would stand by and do nothing? Russia is already a de facto example. When Chechen terrorists blew up civilians in Moscow and St. Petersburg, did the Russian government sit back and do nothing? This year, when Islamists attacked civilians in China, did the Chinese government sit back and do nothing? My point here is that there's an obvious hypocrisy, and actually a lot of that hypocrisy comes from the Arab world, because look at the behaviour of Arab dictators in terms of putting down dissent. So what people say is, oh, the Palestinians are fighting for their freedom, they're opposing the Israeli aggressors, but you can make the same argument for dissidents living in Arab dictatorships, and the response that those dictators take is brute force, torture. So why is there not the same level of condemnation against the Arab states? So what I cannot accept is the hypocrisy here, the obvious hypocrisy.